Hello, Regulation Theory students. Dr. Conway back for Lesson 12, Lecture 12, which is our final lecture for the term. This afternoon we will have our regular scheduled Zoom call at our regular class time for an hour or up to an hour. This afternoon, though, the Zoom call will be especially important because I'll be taking any last-minute questions related to term papers, but more importantly, we'll be talking about scheduling the final exam, and I'll be providing some guidance on how to proceed with the final exam. So it's probably a good idea to make sure you're on that Zoom call, okay? But for now, let's get started on this lesson, which is lesson 12 on ethics and corruption in regulation. A very important topic because one of the things that regulatory officials, regardless of whether they work in the public sector or the private sector, need to be very conscious of is the prospects that they may be exposed to corruption. Okay, that's a reality. It exists in every society. And familiarity with the issue of a corruption and ethics is a very important consideration for everybody being trained in regulation or regulatory affairs. Okay, so let's deal with this question now. Okay, so the first thing you should be well aware of is there's such a thing called a Values and Ethics Code of the public sector in Canada. And I cite that right off the bat because it's indicative of the types of ethics and codes that you will find in most governments and most large corporations. And the Ethics Code basically states that public servants shall serve the public interest by acting at all times with integrity and in a manner that will bear the closest public scrutiny, an obligation that may not be fully satisfied by simply acting within the law. In other words, you have to act within the law, but you have to appear to be acting with the highest standards, even if that means exceeding strict legal obligations. Never using their official roles to inappropriately obtain an advantage for themselves or to advantage or disadvantage others. And believe me, it happens, okay? I can tell you lots of stories of a person I met who is the security official at CRA, the Revenue Agency of Canada, and you'd be amazed the types of activities that can occur, all right? So taking all possible steps to prevent, resolve any real, apparent, or potential conflicts of interest between their official responsibilities and their private affairs in favor of the public interest. In other words, the public interest must outweigh your private interest if you're working in the public sector. Acting in such a way as to maintain their employer's trust. And these principles, will be very much the same if you're working in a large private company or you're working in the government, but obviously the phraseology would be different based on the context and the client or the employer you're working for. But one thing that people don't realize is that corruption is extremely difficult to define because it can take so many different forms. Corruption must also be understood in a cultural and economic context. For example, what Canadians might consider to be corrupt behavior or unethical behavior may not be the same interpretation that you would get in a different country, right? So that's why the definition of corruption and the implementation of anti-corruption measures are so culturally and socially bound and economically influenced. But corruption may involve cash or economic benefits, power or influence, or even less tangible interests, and occurs in both government and the private sector, in free market and closed economies, and in democratic and non-democratic governments and societies. Nobody's immune, obviously, because we're dealing with personal greed and self-interest, and that exists. It doesn't matter what culture, what skin color, what language, it exists everywhere. The only question becomes is what regimes have evolved enough to control it more systematically, okay? So the definition of corruption across countries varies because the baseline they set for measuring corrupt or unethical acts is based on cultural, legal, and institutional traditions, as I implied. The following factors can influence definitions of corruption in different jurisdictions. Moral acceptability. What is acceptable? If you're living in a country like Canada that's relatively wealthy, taking petty bribes by police officers would lead to dismissal. But in some countries, depending upon their economic, social, and cultural circumstances, it may actually be seen as a way of supplementing low-wage law enforcement officials. It may implicitly be accepted as a reality of life because these people are only making $200 a month. Okay? And their definition of moral acceptability would be one of degree rather than banning the practice entirely. Descriptions of the conduct and behavior involved, okay, will vary. Countries will have different interpretations, as I just said, of what's acceptable and what's not. Models involving conflict of interest, breaches of trust, or abuses of principal agent-client relationships, those will be defined differently depending upon the country. The legal profession, for example, the self-regulated legal profession will have one interpretation. The self-regulated real estate profession may have a slightly deviation from that. Whatever the case may be, there will be institutional differences, okay, as well as cross-country national cultural differences. Prevailing economic, political, administrative models. Okay, what's the prevailing practice? For example, in Canada, we have a totally independent public sector, all the way up to the deputy minister. In the United States, when a new government comes in, they replace half the bureaucracy from basically director on up. And this lends itself to obviously horse trading and a number of other things that Canadians would view as completely unacceptable, but the United States would just see as a matter of business. Okay, so it can depend. All right, prevailing economic, political, administrative models will always influence a lot how this is interpreted. Distinctions based on whether the corruption involved public or private sector actors or interests. In some countries, all the emphasis is put on public employees with respect to anti-corruption and ethical behavior. But increasingly, those norms are now being applied to the private sector as well. For example, recent laws on that outlawing corruption of foreign officials by private companies, like the controversy we recently had in Canada with respect to SNC-Lavalin. Okay, so increasingly now, everybody under the criminal code is caught up in these rules with respect to anti-corruption, non-ethical behavior. Okay, whether the actors were engaged in organized crime or more ad hoc forms of corruption, will also define levels of acceptability. Oh, he just took a little bit of money, topic, as opposed to something that is systematically exploiting, let's say, a whole neighborhood through protection rackets or something like that. Okay, so all of these factors will enter into a society's definition of what does corruption mean? Oh, that's okay. Oh, no, it's not. Oh, well, that's just small stuff. It doesn't matter. It must be addressed. It will depend upon the society that we're talking about. And we can see that throughout the world, right? We can see that be based on historical trends, social, cultural, and economic circumstances. So in many developing countries, corruption, in fact, is a direct result of the different economic circumstances of regulatory officials, okay? Regulations become, in some developing countries where regulatory officials, police officers, all types of enforcement officers are paid extremely small amounts of money by Canadian standards. Whereas in Canada, you can be a police officer with the RCMP and start off at maybe $70,000 or $80,000 as a junior officer, but then within 5 years, you're over $100,000. Some people will kind of go, oh, that's a lot of money to pay these people. But what's the alternative? Is the alternative to underpay your enforcement officers and then have them succumb to corruption, or to pay a reasonable wage and battle corruption? And in developing countries, they don't have those options sometimes. Sometimes police officers are paid $200-300 US a month, okay, to enforce the law. And so taking some small stipends, some small backsheesh, if you will, is a common practice, all right? Are people happy with it? No, but what's the alternative to overcome it, unless the regime can begin to pay better wages, and then corruption and ethical violations can be weeded out of the system. And that can take decades, okay? Because once this has become legitimized at a certain level, it's very difficult to then move towards delegitimization, okay? So regulations can become an opportunity to extort benefits from the regulated community if proper legal oversight, transparent institutional mechanisms are not practiced. All right. So this is common. I mean, I've worked for many years in developing countries and on their policy and regulatory frameworks, and this topic invariably comes up. where a senior official will say, well, if we establish a new regulation in this area, all that's going to be is a way for regulators to extort more bribes from the regulated community. Right, so their instinct is immediately to go to that rather than the value of the regulation and its implementation. And these are dilemmas that have built up a lot of cynicism over several decades, to the point where now governments have a downward pressure on public goods because they're afraid that, at the stage of implementation, this just becomes one more of a long legacy of corrupt behavior. All right. It doesn't have to be that way. Many societies have transformed out of that over time. But it takes resources, it takes effort, it takes major anti-corruption initiatives to overcome those trends. Okay. But in most countries, one thing we can say standardly, in most countries, legal and institutional mechanisms have built up over decades to control corruption. And some have been more successful than others. But most countries will rely on the rule of law type of definition for corruption, focusing on conflicts, okay, on a corrupt act that deviates, conflicts between a normal obligation, a normal course of action, or standard of practice, and the corruption incentive to depart from the course of action. So law enforcement officials will typically, even if they can't identify solidly the full scope of a bribe, they'll be able to investigate whether there was an unusual deviation from normal practice of the public official or the corporate official with respect to their conduct. And if they can tie that deviation to some kind of a corrupt incentive, then that will be prosecuted under the law. So the concept is deviation from normal practice that can't be explained by necessity in the practice itself, but rather would be explained by a bribe that compels or encourages the public official to deviate from normal practice. Okay? So proof is found in the transfer of the bribe and in the deviation from typical obligations. Okay? And that's pretty standard now throughout most countries in the world. But that speaks again to what is normal practice. So once something has been culturally, economically, and socially established as normal practice, it's okay. We know that every police officer takes a bet, or every regulatory official takes a bet. Then that becomes normal practice, and then it's more difficult to establish a deviation that's unusual and therefore prosecutable under the law. Okay? So different levels of corruption, okay? Grand corruption involves leadership corruption in the central senior functions of government or a company. This is the large-scale corruption that we've seen in some countries when, for example, billions of dollars in official development assistance go into a country and huge chunks of it never hit the ground. Okay, they're never finished off in terms of whatever funding infrastructure project was being funded, or whatever help was supposed to be given to refugees or to starvation programs or to the working poor or whatever the case may be. Like huge chunks of cash would systematically be exploited, or when there's major permits or licenses required to exploit natural resources or to do anything like that, and massive kickbacks and bribes are paid to senior government officials. And this is why people like Putin in Russia are known to be one of the richest men in the world. Is it because of his salary for being the head of the government in Russia? We have to be realistic, okay? And there are many examples of this grand corruption. I mean, huge scale corruption, okay? Then there's systemic corruption, involving weaknesses in an institution or process that can be exploited for ill-gotten gains. And those are, process-related issues, or there can be various instances where an institution has two conflicting objectives, one to support an industry while another is to regulate an industry, and that exposes that regulatory organization to corruption as officials go from the regulator to the industry and back again, and there's just a bunch of systemic institutional weaknesses that allow the system to be exploited. Okay, and I'll talk in a minute how that's different from regulatory capture. Okay, then there's petty corruption, which can involve the exchange of relatively small amounts of money the granting of minor favors by those seeking preferential treatment, or the employment of friends and relatives in minor positions. And this can be a very dangerous threat to a young regulator or a young regulatory affairs person. You know, somebody comes up to that you have a relationship with and your decisions can influence their outcomes. And they come along and say, yeah, sure, you know, I have a cottage up in there. Take the cottage for a couple of weeks. No, don't worry about it. Don't worry about the money. It's all right. Just take it. I'm not using it anyway. Little things like that can crop up, and they can get you in a great deal of trouble. So you have to really, if you're a regulator, you have to guard against that very strictly. You have to take no benefits from any regulated party or anybody who has an interest in representing regulated parties. Okay, and the same thing can occur in the private sector. Small regulatory officials that work with suppliers, let's say, on them ensuring that they're meeting the regulatory requirements of the purchasing company, and that regulator takes a kickback or takes an under-the-table benefit, or whatever the case may be. They may seem small at the time. What's a couple of weeks at the guy's cottage, right? No problem, right? Until the next time, then they need a favor, and then the next time, and then the next time. And so one of the key things that I always encourage regulatory trainees to do, regulation students to take into account, is that detailed notes are always really critically important, because you can be working in an organization where you're following all of the rules, but then somebody else in the office isn't, okay? And something is discovered, and all of a sudden the RCMP shows up and is starting to ask questions, or whatever the case may be. You want to be the person in the office that has detailed notes of all of the decisions you've taken. If you warned the company against a potential corrupt situation, or if you identify such a situation, get it in writing, send it up the ladder. Keep detailed notes. If you're talking to a regulator at any given time, I talked to Jane at Health Canada on January 14th for 1 hour related to the following topic, where I was alerting the regulator to this situation. You mark it down. Okay, because you'll never know a situation where you might be hauled in to testify in a court of law. You might be, might be questioned by the RCMP or the OPP or whatever the case may be related to a regulatory matter. So you detailed notes. Take regulation when you're making these kind of concrete decisions is not a laughing matter. You need to take detailed notes. Okay. And there's different types of interpretations of when bribery occurs, regardless of the type. Active bribery refers to the offering or paying of a bribe. Okay, that is clearly going to be against the law, both in the public and private sector. Passive bribery, however, refers to the receiving of the bribe, and that also, if you formally receive a bribe and you're a public official, okay, you're going to get seriously, probably reprimanded, if not brought up on criminal charges, and probably dismissed. Okay? So under Canadian law, both of these, active and passive bribery, are illegal and subject to prosecution. This includes cases when there is an actual corrupt act and when there is an attempt at a corrupt act with respect to public officials. Even if the corrupt act did not follow through, if you're approached with a bribe of any kind and you're working as a public official, you must report that. If you do not report it, and later on it is found out that this corrupt activity has been taking place with other officials, and they find out that you were offered that, even if you didn't accept it, you're going to be caught up in that corruption net. So you need to really, take that into account. And that's increasingly becoming, this is much more clearly a public sector official issue, but it's increasingly becoming a factor in private sector as governments bring in more laws related to anti-corruption activities within the private sector, as we just saw with the SS11 case and the president and CEO of SNC actually being prosecuted under the law. Okay, a huge multi-billion-dollar corporation, and we saw it with Volkswagen, didn't we? Right, the board of directors of Volkswagen all going to jail. All right, over the Dieselgate scandal. With respect to the regulatory capture, it's important to distinguish regulatory capture from corruption, although they can be related, obviously. In regulatory regulations end up being developed to protect powerful interests against competition or modified to harm these interests. Okay, to not harm these interests. Rather, into those conditions, you can have regulatory capture occur without overt personal corruption. It can be just that the regulated party has become too influential in the organization. We've become too friendly. I'm a regulator. I've been working with this party for a long time. I know their name. I know the names of their children. I know their wife. Every once in a while we'll see them out in the restaurant. Hey, Bob, how's it going? All these kind of things, right? And that regulatory capture can happen that way because it's a natural human instinct to be more familiar with people we deal with on an ongoing basis. And that familiarity, as a human species, as a communal species, will end up influencing our behavior, okay? Unless we're very conscious of it, all right? And this is why a lot of regulatory bodies will force rotations in their regulators, okay? In a lot of regulatory bodies, you're not allowed to work on the file for more than 2 or 3 years, and you're rotated out to another file. And the reason for that is exactly this, to prevent regulatory capture. But regulatory capture can happen in more systematic ways, right? Like, for example, you can have a regulatory body like Canadian Radio and Telecommunications Commission, where their mandate is both to regulate the industry and ensure the economic viability of the industry. So you can see that for a long time, lots of people were suspicious, and they continued to be suspicious about decisions taken by the CRTC, let's say with respect to the cost of mobile phone services and these kinds of things, because here's an organization that has right in its bowels 2 potentially conflicting objectives, okay? And the CRTC is not the only one, right? We find that with other regulators related to energy and these kinds of things. And these can present serious problems if they're not monitored on an ongoing basis. But those would be kind of regulatory capture type issues rather than pure institutional corruption type issues. Because regulatory capture can occur without overt corruption where an individual at a senior, medium, or lower level is extracting personal benefits. Okay, you can have regulatory capture, and you can have people just collecting their regular salaries, never taking an extra cent or anything like that, but still the regulatory process itself is producing distorted outcomes that favor one party over another unfairly. All right, but corruption by and the other thing about regulatory capture is you might prove not only no bribe but no deviation from normal obligations, which we defined as the legal interpretation. Whereas in corruption you'll find both. Okay, and that's an important distinction to make. All right. So the following key factors should be considered when distinguishing regulatory capture from overt corruption. Institutional independence of the regulator, including legal, cultural, and political basis for independence. In other words, is a normal practice going on, all the proper safeguards in place, yet we still have some problems with regulatory capture, okay? Potential conflicts of interest between the different roles of the regulator. I just described the CRTC, all right, where that can happen. Skills and security of tenure of regulators. If there's no incentive to the regulator to deviate from their job requirements because they have tenure and they have security, and we're not seeing any bribe and we're not seeing any deviation from practice, then there's probably a good indication that we're not witnessing corruption, we're witnessing some other distortion in the regulatory function, probably regulatory capture, okay? Resources of the regulator. Is the regulator well-resourced? Can they pay their staff adequately? If they're not, well, we might have more cause for concern, right? So we'll look at whether there was any payment causing deviation. If the regulator has got, good security of tenure, reasonably well paid, has the appropriate skills, yet we're still getting some weird outcomes, then we look at other mechanisms that are contributing to regulatory capture as opposed to pure forms of corruption, okay? So this is an important topic, folks. I mean, I wish we were doing this one face-to-face because I would be able to animate it more. But believe me, I've investigated a lot over the years in these issues in developing countries all over the place with respect to environmental and public health regulation. And it's a complex subject, but it's a very important subject, okay? So look, On this score, I'll wrap this lecture up and we'll talk to everybody 4 o'clock this afternoon on a regular scheduled Zoom call. And in that call, we'll be talking about any last minute questions for your term papers, and we'll be talking about the final exam. Okay? Talk to everybody later. Bye-bye now.